Here's the thing, Bruce. I'm great at controlling my anger. When I'm catcalled in the street, I'm an expert at controlling my anger because I do it infinitely more than you. So all of this
Oh
just feels like
no.
projecting. Jennifer Walters, attorney at law.
Every time I think that Disney has made the worst possible TV show or movie, somehow they managed to lower the bar even further. The trailers for this series simply did not do it justice. Yes, there were obvious problems with CGI and the writing, but I was caught off guard at how unbelievably and hilariously awful this show actually turned out to be. This first episode alone is easily the worst thing ever created for the MCU, and that's saying a lot when you take into consideration dumpster fires like The Eternals and the recent female Thor movie. Brace yourself because this series is worse than you can imagine. She-Hulk is bad, Episode 1. Couple quick things to cover before I break down the episode. Before the show was even released, Disney was already in full damage control, doing all the standard stuff like saying, if you don't like the show, it's because you hate women. They do this every single time they're about to release something they know is going to be awful, and they merely want to shift the blame. Of course, this nonsense doesn't work anymore, but they try it anyways.
Don't blame others for your bad decision.
Another thing is that the CGI is terrible, though this is not unique because a lot of Disney's recent projects have had terrible CGI. The reason for this is obvious. Disney is prioritizing quantity over quality, with a new show being released every 6 weeks, whether it's for the MCU or Star Wars. They're just cranking out as much content as they possibly can. However, when confronted with the bad CGI, the show creators for this series decided to take a very, shall we say, strange route and blame the bad CGI on men having unrealistic expectations of women, as if that somehow had anything to do with the bad CGI. Basically, it was just another way of them saying, it's not our fault that it's garbage, it's because you hate the womans. Do you happen to see a pattern developing here?
Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
However, this strikes closer to home than you might think, because there does happen to be a great deal of sexism in regard to this show, except it comes exclusively from the writers and not from the audience. As you'll see, it's pretty clear that the writers on this show have a very deep-seated hatred of men, and they choose to express that through both the dialogue and the characters. The episode begins with Jennifer in her office practicing a speech in front of a few others. She works as a lawyer, and this is going to be her closing argument. However, as she's leaving the room, she stops and turns directly to the camera and starts speaking to the audience. Now, I realize that some people might not like this and might think that it breaks immersion, but She-Hulk does have the ability to break the fourth wall, just like some other characters like Deadpool, Joker, and Animal Man. She-Hulk is capable of doing this, and I can't believe I'm actually saying this, but in this regard, Disney is adhering to the canon of the character by allowing her to break the fourth wall.
You're not as stupid as you look, Ike.
She says that she needs to explain what's been happening up until now, which leads into a flashback of Jen and Bruce sitting in a car. This appears to take place shortly after the events of Endgame, because Bruce Banner still has an injury from his use of the Infinity Stones. He is once again in human form, and he explains that this is possible because of some sort of device that he created. The conversation starts with an obvious product placement for Cheetos, which also happens again later in the episode. I don't have a problem with this sort of thing, just don't make it as obnoxious as they do in this episode. Regardless, this is followed by the show creators wasting over a minute of screen time with Jen talking about Captain America. No, not him. See, that's not, no. See, that's the Falcon. I was referring to Captain America. Yeah, that guy, right there. I know sometimes people get confused. See, first one's the Falcon, this one's Captain America. Anyways, Jennifer wastes over a minute of screen time in order to make a joke about how Steve Rogers must still be a virgin, and as you would expect, this is not time well spent, as the joke falls completely flat.
I'm glad to see you got a sense of humor.
Suddenly, a spaceship appears in front of them, and Jennifer swerves off the road, resulting in the crash, leading into the MCU. Phase 4 of the MCU is referred to as the MCU because Disney decided that they wanted the entire focus of Marvel to be based around women. They do this not by lifting up female characters, but rather by tearing down popular male characters so that the female characters look better in contrast. The argument from woke weirdos is that the MCU was centered around male characters for the first few years, so it's only fair that Disney switches it and now makes it all about female characters. However, this claim is both stupid and wrong. The first 3 phases of the MCU were not centered around male characters. They were centered around popular characters who happen to be male. But Disney and other woke weirdos don't understand that, and as a result, we got the MCU, and that is the reason why the next scene will break canon and play out the way that it does.
Oh shit, here we go again.
In the show, after the crash, Jen only has a very small injury on her arm, while Bruce is much more severely injured, while also helplessly dangling upside down while stuck in his seatbelt like an idiot. Jen manages to pull him out of the car, but in the process, a small amount of his blood drips into her injury, and this causes an almost immediate reaction, and Jen transforms for the first time into She-Hulk. However, that bullshit didn't happen in the comics and is not canon. It was Bruce who came to the rescue for Jennifer. She had been severely injured in an attack and needed a blood transfusion. Bruce was the only one available, but it wasn't a simple matter for him. He needed to make a difficult decision. He knew that if he gave his blood to his cousin, who shared enough genetic similarity, that she would also gain the Hulk affliction that he has. This was a problem for him because Bruce believed that the Hulk was a curse and had ruined his life, and he did not want to make someone else that he cared about suffer in the same way. But the alternative was to simply let Jennifer die, so Bruce ultimately made the decision to save Jennifer, but also curse her with the Hulk affliction. The canon comic book version of these events made it so that Bruce saved Jennifer and did so only through a very difficult decision. The MCU version, on the other hand, which is not canon, I might add, removes all of Bruce's agency and instead made him a bumbling, helpless idiot, and Jen only gains her power through sheer stupid luck. These changes were made because of the rules that Disney created for the MCU, that female characters are not allowed to be depicted as weak, and they must always be able to save themselves. Male characters are prohibited from being able to save female characters in danger. It is simply not allowed in the MCU. Female characters must always be the ones that rescue the male characters.
You're a man when I tell you you're a man.
Regardless, because of Bruce's blood and bad CGI, Jennifer turns into Shrek and runs off into the forest, where she wakes up in the middle of the night and then wanders over to a sports bar and sneaks into the bathroom in order to clean herself up. But don't worry, it gets worse. The next 2 scenes set up even more of the man-hating nonsense from the writers. Moments after entering the bathroom, another group of women also enter, and they notice that Jen is in a disheveled state, and instantly they accuse a man of doing it to her. Then they try to help her in possibly the stupidest way possible by prioritizing her makeup and giving her a new pair of shoes.
How come God hogs up all the good followers and me get all the retards?
Shortly after, Jen walks outside, where she is immediately accosted by several drunk male characters. But since Jen is such a girl boss, she turns into Shrek and attacks them. One of the most basic things in writing is that every scene needs to add something to the story, otherwise it's just worthless filler. I've talked about this before, how Disney likes to add useless nonsense in order to extend and pad out the length of an episode, but this scene in particular is much worse than that. That's because this scene doesn't actually add anything to Jennifer's character, it doesn't push the storyline further, and having her transform into Shrek a second time doesn't have any meaningful impact. Additionally, the end of this scene is going to be a fade out, which is exactly what happened in the previous scene. So it doesn't have any change other than that it was simply inserted into the episode. However, there is one reason and one reason alone why this scene was included in the show, and that is to push the man-hating agenda of the writers.
Now we'll build a projection machine.
It is impossible not to notice the writers' intended dichotomy being presented here between these two groups, where the first reaction of the women is to help Jen, and the first reaction of the men is to harass her. Essentially, women are good and men are bad, in the dumbest, most blunt way possible. This, of course, does not actually represent reality, but rather the bigoted, hateful mindset of the writers themselves. something I am sure that they are too stupid to even realize. The following scene has Jen waking up in a bed that looks like it's some sort of vacation beach home, and once again, I want to point out that this could have easily happened immediately after her first Shrek incident without the need for the idiotic sports bar scene. She wanders downstairs to find Bruce back in his Smart Hulk form, and a little bit of a side note here, it's really annoying that we never got any proper character development for Bruce and the Hulk. Instead, we just got 2 minutes worth of exposition during the Endgame movie, and as one of the most important characters throughout the entire franchise, I would think that Hulk deserves better than that. Unfortunately, that's not what's going to happen, because we're about to see Hulk get treated like secondhand trash for the rest of the episode.
You make me sad.
Bruce explains what happened and that Jen has now changed. He says that her method of generating gamma even allowed him to fully repair his arm, to which she responds, "Oh, so that means I'm better than you." Because fucking of course. But don't worry, it gets worse. Bruce drops a huge folder on the table and explains that he documented all of his trouble as the Hulk, and it's going to take Jen about 15 years in order to fully integrate her personalities. But as we're going to find out very shortly, she doesn't need that many years in order to figure it out, because she's not a dumb man. Instead, she's a super smart woman who's strong and independent, and she's better than Bruce in every possible way.
You must think me a fool to make your lies so transparent.
Bruce locks Jen in a dangerous room that causes her to transform into Shrek, and then she breaks out. But then the both of them realize that Jen doesn't have an alternate Hulk personality. This, however, is not entirely consistent with canon. In the comics, Jennifer is able to retain nearly all of her intelligence when she turns into She-Hulk. However, there is still a noticeable difference in their personalities. But the show creators decided to get rid of that entirely and instead just made it so that She-Hulk is better than the Hulk, because fucking of course. We're then treated to a lovely montage where Jen easily outperforms Bruce in every single activity, which causes Bruce to act like a very immature man baby, because fucking of course. But don't worry, it gets worse. The following morning, Bruce is talking to Jen about controlling her anger, and Jen's response is unbelievably dumb, extraordinarily naive, overwhelmingly arrogant, and delusional beyond comprehension. And of course, all of this is just projection by the man-hating writers. Jen proclaims that she is infinitely better at controlling anger and stress than she is because her life is far more dangerous than his. And then she makes the claim that she is in constant fear of her life by just walking down the street where she'll get catcalled by random men. Oh no! At this point, she begins to change into Shrek, and it would seem that her arrogance was unjustified and that Bruce was right. But instead, the writers double down on their stupidity, where Jen is able to immediately return to her normal form with no effort, and even brags about it to Bruce, who seems dumbfounded at what's happening.
I hate this. It is revolting.
This scene is breathtakingly awful for numerous reasons. Let's start by addressing some of the things that Jen said, because all of it is nothing more than delusional fiction created by a bunch of deranged feminist writers. The idea that women are in constant danger by simply walking down the street or getting into an elevator with someone they don't know is absurd. It is irrational scaremongering not backed up by reality or any statistical data of any kind. The truth? Men comprise 83% of victims, and women are only 17%.
I know a killer when I see one.
Secondly, Jen and the writers are pushing the nonsensical idea that women are constantly being catcalled, which is objectively, verifiably false. Now, I don't dispute that some random drunk guy might do it every once in a blue moon, but the reality is that catcalling is extraordinarily rare, and pretending that it's a constant thing for any woman merely walking down the street is fucking ridiculous.
Yeah, and you're ugly.
But despite all of the blatant lies that Jen is saying, what makes this entire situation all the more appalling is that Jen knows about all the things that have happened to Bruce. And in case some of you may not be aware, here's a quick recap of the highlights. Throughout his entire childhood, Bruce was abused by his father. Bruce also witnessed his mother being killed by his father. Bruce was experimented on and eventually turned into a monster that everybody hated. Bruce lost control of his own body to another personality. Bruce was hunted throughout the entire world by various governments, forcing himself into seclusion. Bruce's situation got so desperate that he tried to take himself out numerous times, and that's only the half of it, because there's also the guilt that he had for being unable to prevent Thanos from using the Infinity Stones, and then losing the woman he loved because she had to sacrifice in order to get one of the stones to undo the mistake that he made by not being able to stop Thanos. And that doesn't even mention all of the other times that Bruce was put into life-threatening situations.
I wonder if you're the worst person I've ever met.
And that's why Jen is a piece of shit, because she knows about everything that Bruce has gone through, and yet she is still pretending as if a drunk guy yelling something is the equivalent of everything that Bruce went through.
And the truth shall set you free!
The irony here is that during her little speech, she claims that Bruce was projecting his problems onto her, when in reality, it was the writers who were projecting their own sexist, man-hating, delusional fantasies into this show and on those characters. And since Jen has decided to behave in such a disgustingly abhorrent manner, allow me a small retort. On the matter of catcalling, ahem, honey, I hate to be the bearer of some bad news, but apparently you don't own a mirror. Because if you did, you would realize that you are at best a 4 on a good day, which means that ain't nobody gonna be catcalling your out of shape, pantsuit wearing, frumpy dumpy looking ass. Damn! Regardless, Jen decides that since she's so much better and smarter than Bruce, she can easily go back to her old life with no problems. However, Bruce knows that this is dumb and doesn't want her to leave. Jen gets into a Jeep and tries to drive away, hitting Bruce in the process, who, I should point out, is still in his Hulk form. Despite the fact that the Jeep is moving at most 10 miles an hour, Bruce still gets thrown about 50 feet away, where he smashes through a bunch of boulders.
I have questions.
This is utterly ridiculous. First of all, the Jeep would not be able to throw the Hulk like that. I mean, look at what Hulk was able to do during the Avengers movie. If he can stop that thing, then a Jeep moving at 10 miles an hour is not going to launch him 50 feet across the yard. Also, keep in mind that the Hulk probably weighs more than that vehicle does, and it's simply not going to have enough force to launch him the way it did, and it definitely is not going to have enough power to smash through the boulders. Like, none of this makes any sense at all. But don't worry, it gets worse. Bruce is still being very rational, and he's trying to reason with Jen, who simply doesn't want to listen. She gets out of the Jeep, turns into Shrek, and punches him. This is the same sort of behavior that I pointed out during the Party Thor episode of What If, where Captain Marvel, without any provocation, attacks Thor twice. But again, this sort of thing is considered okay because it's a woman attacking a man. But if it was the other way around, oh no, suddenly that would be wrong. Jen continues to attack Bruce until he finally uses the seismic clap, which is a signature move for the Incredible Hulk. But because Jen is so much better than he is, not only is she able to figure out how to do that move within seconds, but her version is significantly more powerful, and then the Hulk falls to the ground and curls up like a baby, because fucking of course. Let me say that again. The Incredible Hulk falls to the ground and curls up like a baby.
Right.
The two continue fighting for a little more until they both accidentally damage Bruce's bar, which has sentimental value for him, so they end up stop fighting, but he demands that she help fix it. The two of them end up getting back on good terms after they're done with this, and Bruce reluctantly gives his blessing to Jen going back to her normal life. At which point, Jen reaffirms that she is still a worthless piece of shit, by saying that she apologizes for all the mean stuff that she said, even though that it was still true. Which, of course, is wrong. Just completely, totally, and utterly wrong. It's a bunch of bullshit. Absolutely none of the things that she said was true. Jen is a sexist, man-hating piece of garbage because she was written that way by a group of writers who are also sexist, man-hating garbage.
Good attitude. You are still an absolute scumbag, though.
It then moves back to the opening scene with Jen still in her office, and she heads off to the courtroom. However, before she's able to give her closing argument, the Kool-Aid Man breaks through the wall. I kind of wish I could say that I was joking here, but this is quite literally the exact same thing that happened during an episode of Family Guy. Look at this.
Oh yeah!
This is supposed to be a character from the comics named Titiana, but if we compare whatever this monstrosity is versus the canon comic book version, there seems to be something strangely different about this version of the character. Because of course, it wouldn't be a Disney show if they didn't include some extraordinarily racist blackwashing again. Which means we get to put another stamp on the card.
I see this as an absolute win.
Even if we set aside the blackwashing, what in the hell is with this laughably cheap wig and outfit? Why does this character look like the costume department only spent $5 at the local Spirit Halloween? But don't worry, it gets worse. Now, it's really hard to put into words what is about to happen, so let me just show you.
It's definitely a no for me, dog.
Now, I have seen some bad wire work before. Black Widow had a whole bunch of it. But this is on another level. I have to ask, how could any person sitting in that editing room look at this and say, yeah, you know what? That's good. Let's go with that. And it gets even dumber, because after this poor excuse for a fight, Jen's assistant puts down Jen's shoes that she had taken off before the fight started, and then the show starts playing some idiotic girl boss music while Jen casually struts over and changes back into normal form, and then she steps into the shoes and she turns around and says she's ready to give her closing argument. I don't know what's more pathetic, this scene or the fact that the show creators thought it was a good idea to include it. Regardless, we then get an extra end credit scene where the show picks up with that virgin joke that Jen was making at the beginning of the show. Bruce confirms that Steve Rogers did in fact lose his virginity back in 1948, and once again, this joke falls flat, but also it's been made pretty clear in the other Disney Plus shows and the more recent movies that the world knows that Steve Rogers is still alive. He just kind of went off the grid and he didn't want anything to do with anybody for a little while. So it doesn't make any sense for Jen to repeatedly say that he died a virgin when she and everybody else knows that he's still alive. Although I suppose that nonsense fits perfectly with this series. We're only one episode in, and already this is easily the worst thing in the entire MCU. Or more appropriately, I should say, the MCU. But thankfully, that's the end of episode 1.